Today's session, An Army of Problem Solvers, is brought to you by the Canadian Community Economic Development Network. We are a national network of several hundred community organizations and individuals working to create local economic opportunities that support an inclusive and sustainable economy. Here you can see a few of our members' logos. And here you can see an image of our new website member map. You can find members close to you on the map located at the web address listed at the bottom of the screen. If you like the session today, consider joining us by becoming a member, signing up for our free e-newsletters, or following us on social media. So a quick background here, CCEDNet has done a number of webinars like this one in recent years. Here you can see some of the topics covered, and all of those are on our website free for our members. So allow me to welcome you again. Here you can see a photo of myself. I'll be hosting today's session. And again, my name is Darcy Penner, and I'm the Social Enterprise Policy Manager for the Canadian CED Network, and we're very pleased to have you here with us today. Our presenter today is Shaun Loney, a friend and mentor of mine and a longtime member of the Canadian CED Network. Shaun is also an Ashoka Fellow, the first in the Canadian Prairies, and an Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year in 2014. Shaun has co-founded and mentored 11 social enterprises, including Build, which was the 2011 Scotiabank Eco-Living Green Business of the Year, as well as the 2013 Manitoba Apprenticeship Employer of the Year. Shaun was Director of Energy Policy for the Government of Manitoba from 2000 to 2008, and a political advisor to the Gary Dewar's NDP from 1997 to 2002. Shaun lives in Winnipeg with his partner Fiona, and between them they have 3 teenage boys. Shaun is proud to be part of a strong and a visionary social enterprise team that is flourishing across the country. His book, An Army of Problem Solvers, is actually Shaun's second book, following his previous Build Prosperity, Energizing Manitoba's Local Economy. So before we get to the presentation, I think let's get to know each other a bit better with 2 quick polls of participants. You should now see 2 questions that have popped up on the screen. They are asking you the question of how familiar are you with social enterprise. So if you could please check one of the boxes that you see there. This basically helps mostly Shaun and myself to make sure that we're kind of gauging putting the conversation into the right place and speaking at a place where everyone's at. And also, there's another question down there. What are you hoping to get out of the webinar today? Please put a short answer into there, and that again will also help us to cater some of the content here as we go along. So while people are doing that and providing those answers, I'm going to introduce the session while that's going on. So, an army of problem solvers. Unemployment on First Nations and in inner-city neighborhoods. Climate change. Exponential diabetes rates. Unaffordable government. High incarceration rates. There are no shortage of chronic and insatiable societal problems. An army of problem solvers offers good news at a time when we need it most. In the book, Shaun Loney draws on his experience as one of Canada's leading social enterprise developers and his time as a senior civil servant to offer up a new and practical vision. Who are the problem solvers? An army of problem solvers argues that social enterprises, social entrepreneurs, and the small farm movement comprise the solutions economy. This book comes at a time when Canada is discussing what reconciliation between Indigenous Canadians and the rest of the country means. Shaun Loney argues that we can't achieve it without allowing the re-emergence of local economies. The book, An Army of Problem Solvers, answers the question, what does nation to nation mean? And with that, I think we were going to hand this over to Shaun Loney. Shaun, if you're there.
I am. Good morning, because it's still morning here in Winnipeg, and very happy to be joining the webinar, and just also very excited and feel very grounded to be a member of CCEDNet. Proud to connect with that network across Canada. I think CCEDNet, of all the different groups and organizations in Canada, I feel I belong mostly with, or more identify most strongly with. So it's this is an event I've been looking forward to for some time. I've met several of you that are on the call, but most I haven't. So looking forward to getting to know you a bit better later in a question and answer period that we're going to have. But thanks, Darcy, for the introduction. You have a very nice radio voice, by the way.
Thanks, Shaun. I practiced all last night.
So, yes, we put out an Army of Problem Solvers in late September, and we're very happy to say it's already into second printing. And we've had book launches all across Canada, which have been very successful. St. John's, Newfoundland, Toronto, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, Edmonton, Victoria, and Vancouver, and several speaking engagements coming up in the new year. We'll be updating our website soon. The website, if you're interested, is www.armyofproblemsolvers.com, which we'll keep updated what our speaking agenda is going to be, and hopefully wherever you are, we can connect soon. So we've had several highlights, I guess I would say, about the book launches. Brandon, Manitoba, we ended up with a round dance, which was very emotional and very exciting. We had the Minister of Finance attend in St. John's, Newfoundland, who, by her own admission, says we're out of money, but we still have problems. And my response to her was, well, this is an excellent environment to begin to engage problem solvers, as Darcy said, identifying the book problem solvers as social entrepreneurs, social enterprises, and the small farm movement that can begin to resolve a lot of the insatiable problems that we have in Canada. In Toronto, I was very proud to see that Hugh Siegel attended our event, and Art Eggleton, and they've both actually endorsed the new version of the book, which is coming out very shortly. I work at Winnipeg's Social Enterprise Center. You can see a picture of it there. It's in Winnipeg's North End. It's an old CPR mail sorting facility. It's 30,000 square feet, and it's full of social enterprises and supporting organizations like CCEDNet, and owned by the nonprofit social enterprises you can see listed on the end of the building. We purchased the building because we wanted to put our money where our mouth is and say we need to be creating wealth in the community as opposed to just paying other people rent. And it was a bit of a mind shift for us. It's obviously a huge building, 30,000 square feet, but we have it largely full and would love to see new buildings like this emerging in other places in Winnipeg. We're working on getting a social enterprise center going in Portage La Prairie, Manitoba. Brandon, Manitoba also has a small version of this, and be happy to support others across Canada that are looking. It's such an exciting hub of activity, and we certainly feed off each other and support each other there. So some of the social enterprises that are housed at the Social Enterprise Center are Build. Build has celebrated its 10th year this year, and Build hires folks mostly Indigenous, mostly male, and people that have several barriers to employment. So the main barrier we look for, other than Indigenous and or refugee, is people with very long, very extensive contact with the justice system. And Build has lowered utility bills now at 16,000 low-income households in Winnipeg. That's about $6 million a year reduction in utility bills. And Build has a training contract with the government of Manitoba, but 70% of its revenues come from contracts with mostly public and nonprofit housing providers. Manitoba Green Retrofit was set up in 2009, and it hires graduates of Build. Its payroll is now well in excess of $1.5 million, and does apartment renovations, apartment turnovers, apartment maintenance, does some demolition jobs, but also bed bug remediation. And I like to say, imagine this new paradigm where there's actually something good about bed bugs, because of course we can hire people to create employment in with money that's being spent on trying to mitigate poverty. And I currently spend most of my time at Aki Energy, and Aki is an Ojibwe word for earth, and we do geothermal on First Nations. We've done $7 million worth of geothermal since 2013, now on 5 different First Nations in Manitoba. And I'll tell you a bit later about how we go about doing that, because we've been able to do it with no government funding for the core infrastructure. And I'm also going to tell you a couple horrific stories about our interactions with the federal government. This is a picture of a crew at the Fisher River Cree Nation, and they've installed geothermal at 200 different homes, and they are, along with Aki, one of the largest geothermal companies in Canada, and proud to say a social enterprise that we were able to set up. And here's a crew at the Peguis First Nation in the Interlake in Manitoba, and they're getting ready to install loop that goes below the frost line. In Manitoba, that's about 7 feet down. Each house costs about $20,000 to put in this geothermal technology, and reduces utility bills significantly. And about half of that $10,000 is labor, and almost all of that is used right on the First Nation. So it's an excellent tool for social enterprise development. This is a picture, an older staff photo of Manitoba Green Retrofit, and I talked about them briefly earlier. They're probably about twice that size now, which is very exciting. Build's model has been copied in several places across Canada, and we are, being a nonprofit, and one of the exciting things about it is that we are in the business not of empire building, but of exporting our model, and very happy to spend time and resources to do that. But Brandon, their social enterprise there is called BEEP, the Brandon Energy Efficiency Program, and one of the things they're doing now is building new homes for the Canadian Mental Health Association, and they're building big, family homes, and it's a great work for their folks that are learning in the construction business. Building Up is in its second year now in Toronto, and Building Up has been focusing on doing water retrofits as it has begun. It's also been building wheelchair ramps, and is moving into painting in nonprofit and public housing. And they have a relationship in Toronto with the Black Daddies Club, and so working with a lot of black men who are eager to reconnect with their kids and use employment as a tool to do that, to get their life stable. In St. John's, Newfoundland, the social enterprise there is called Impact Construction, and they've done a lot of insulating, and they are now moving into new home construction and home renovations. So those are some other enterprises that you can check out. This is a picture of a painting crew Building Up in Toronto, and this is one of their staff, and I love this picture because the guy is just so happy because he's got employment, and you'd wonder why you'd be happy replacing an old toilet, but he's obviously thrilled to be there and proud to be part of a very inspiring team. But the problem-solving sector is more than about social enterprises. This is a family, Will and Jen, and their 2 kids from Morden, Manitoba, and they're part of the local food movement. In Manitoba, we have several problems ranging from, that are food-related, ranging from high phosphorus and nitrogen levels in our lakes, including Lake Winnipeg, rural depopulation. We're now at a point where in Canada we're spending 75% of our healthcare spending is on diseases where diet is the main risk factor. And of course, fossil fuel consumption, by some estimates in agriculture, big ag, about 90% of expenditures are on pesticides and fertilizers, which are largely fossil fuels. And by that connection, we're basically eating fossil fuels as we go along. So these are problems that government is not going to solve, but the problem-solving sector can solve them. The issue we have, of course, is that, and most of you will be familiar with this, is that governments make it very difficult for problem solvers. This is a picture of a social enterprise that workers that we started in the Garden Hill First Nation. Garden Hill is in Manitoba. It is about 600 or 700 kilometers northeast of Winnipeg, and it's a community. It's an Ojibwe community that you have to fly into, and that means that the food is very expensive. They also have a northern store, which is a capitalist, profit-seeking, monopoly retailer. And here's an example of how governments make it very difficult for problem solvers. We have a 13-acre farm. It's a fantastic operation. We've just completed our second year. We have some greenhouses there, 13 acres, root crops. We have an orchard, and we have 1,000 chickens. Well, first of all, it's illegal to have 1,000 chickens because in Manitoba you need to have a quota in order to have more than to have that many chickens. But the bigger problem is that not a single thing that our social enterprise there does, the social enterprise is called Meacham, which is an Ojibwe word for food. Not a single thing that we raise or grow is eligible for federal government subsidies. And the reason is because you actually have to bring the food in by airline in order to be eligible for the subsidies. So we could fly our food out and then fly it back in, and we would get the subsidy. Now, so that's obviously beyond annoying and very frustrating, but we later found out that the Nutrition North Canada food subsidy program, we think, gives a northern store in Garden Hill that sells virtually very limited amounts of healthy food, but they get somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million a year in your taxpayer money, and they are actually a problem maker in that the vast majority of food that they sell is unhealthy. And so we're saying to the federal government, this is very reminiscent of how First Nations have been treated in the post-contact period. There used to be an Indian agents that would be the Queen's representative that controlled First Nations, and I document in the book several ways in which, as I describe in the book, that we're very familiar with the residential school process, or at least Canadians are finding out about it. But at the same time as we were taking the Indian out of the child at the residential schools, we were taking the Indian out of the economy back at home on First Nations. And I document several ways in which that was done. But in order to sell anything off the First Nation, you had to get the permission of this Indian agent. And the Indian agent would then turn around and protect outside businesses from competition from First Nation ventures by making sure the products were sold very inexpensively. And what it did is it ran First Nation ventures into the ground. So First Nation fishers, and this is well documented, got much less and sometimes half as much as non-Aboriginal fishers. And I know my grandparents, grandparents were farmers in Saskatchewan, and the research I did there showed that First Nation grain farmers actually didn't have access to local markets at all. They had to wagon their crops down to the United States. So there's lots of ways in which the federal government was ensuring that First Nation economic ventures were unsuccessful. And that was a bit alarming for me, but it's even more alarming to know that these things are still happening now. And I note that Justin Trudeau said yesterday that he's going to ask his Justice Minister to do a review of the colonial policies and legislation that exist in the federal government, and we're certainly very keen to participate in that process. This picture is of myself on the right and Stan McKay on the left, and in the book Stan tells his story as a Cree elder from Fish River Cree Nation as to what happened to his economy at the Fish River Cree Nation in Manitoba, and he explains that when the settlers were moving in, surrounding the reserve area, that they cut the trees down, and the big game disappeared, and they started to irrigate their land, and the irrigation destroyed the trapping industry. And he also explains that the fluctuation in water levels because of the irrigation was very damaging to many of the food activities that they had undertaken before. So Stan's example is actually quite typical, and his parents sent him to residential school, and I asked him what he meant by sent him, because I said I thought that residential schools were mandatory. And he says, well, they were mandatory because there were no options for him at home because the economy had collapsed. And so I think it's important for us, especially those of us that are privileged Canadians, to understand where our privilege comes from. And I like to quote I believe he's a basketball coach from the United States, and about 50 years ago, Scheitzer, and he says that some of us were born on third base but think that we hit a triple. And so here's a picture of two people. One of us was born on third base, obviously me, and I document my family's history briefly as an example. And Stan McKay, who has had to overcome a lot of barriers in his life that were largely economic. I also talk in the book about what we've decided to call the 3 poverty myths. And it's been quite a surprise to me the degree to which low-income Canadians, low-income Indigenous Canadians want to work. This is a picture of Manitoba's, in Winnipeg, of our north end, and we're posting some temporary jobs. This is 7:30 in the morning, and the lineups go right around the block. And some of our social enterprises have 3 and 4 years worth of resumes to go through, and no shortage of people wanting to work. So I document that as a major myth in Canada that we need to get our heads around. The second myth is that there isn't enough money, and wow, there's lots of money. It's just not being spent on the right things. It's being focused more on the problems rather than used to support the problem solvers. And we've often forgotten that you need a problem solver to solve a problem, and I think that's the direction in which we're trying to push governments, and hopefully someday soon it'll be actually easy to solve problems. The third myth, which was also a bit of a surprise to me, and something that I first read about from Jane Jacobs, is that poverty has no causes. I've come to believe that we need to move beyond this language and these approaches to say that we need to get at the root causes of poverty. We've been working at this for 30, 40 years in Canada. talking about getting at the root causes of poverty, and frankly, it hasn't got us anywhere. Jane Jacobs says that darkness has no causes, it's the absence of light, and cold has no causes, it's the absence of heat, and poverty is nothing more than the absence of prosperity. And we need to start focusing on prosperity and giving communities, low-income communities, First Nations, and low-income families the tools to be successful. And our experience is that people will take this prosperity ladder and they might go up 3 or 4 rungs and then come down a couple, but I have yet to see anyone that doesn't jump at the opportunity of climbing the ladder. And so I talk in the book about these 3 poverty myths and how enlightening that's been for me on my own personal journey in these areas. The paradigm is shifting, and it's I think it's shifting quickly. I talk in the book about how even the political paradigm is shifting. We see Republican states in the United States that are pushing a $15 an hour minimum wage, and the reason why they're doing that is because governments are are spending a lot of money subsidizing the working poor because they're not being people are, even though they're working full-time, are not able to pay their own bills. So there's a chapter in the book about minimum wage and how what answer we can give to people when they say, well, there will be less work if we move to a $15 an hour minimum wage. There's actually absolutely no economic study that shows that a high minimum wage causes net job losses. And I think that that's an important tool and something that conservatives can understand is that if you're working full-time, you should be able to pay the bills. So this is an example of where I think that the right is changing. Also, the push to close down jails in the United States is, of course, led by people like Van Jones, but also is supported by people like Newt Gingrich, who is a very right-wing Republican. And the reason why they're supporting closing jails is because it's just got too damn expensive. And so I think in places like Manitoba, we're able to talk to our conservative premier and our conservative justice ministers in their own language to say, look, you need to engage problem solvers because we can save you money, we can make government more affordable. Similarly, on the left, traditionally, folks that identify themselves as being from the left would more naturally tend to support solutions that are bigger government, and that bigger government will be able to address problems like poverty, for example. And what we're seeing is that social movements are becoming more entrepreneurial in how they approach problem solving. And you see in the local food movement, you see it in the social enterprise sector and social enterprises that the solutions they're proposing and working on are more entrepreneurial. And so to me, this is very exciting when you have paradigms that are shifting very quickly. And we see in places like Standing Rock, led by strong Indigenous activists like Winona LaDuke. And this is this picture you're looking at now is from an organization that she's connected to in Minnesota. And this is obviously the type of solution that we're not talking about higher social assistance rates necessarily. We're not talking about lowering taxes for corporations because these are approaches that haven't worked that well, but we are talking about creating an economy where everyone has a place and an economy that is producing good results, and that's pretty exciting. This is a picture of me, and in the middle is Annetta Armstrong. She's a Cree woman that has just was the executive director at BUILD and is now managing a Native Women's Transition Center in the North End in Winnipeg. And we're here with who was recently our police chief, Devon Clunas. And The reason why I like to show this picture is just, again, to kind of get people thinking about how the paradigm is shifting. And the police chief is our biggest supporter, and the reason is because he says that the police continue to arrest over and over again the same people. And we're able, in Manitoba, 75% of people when they get out of jail are back in contact with the justice system within 2 years. We call those recidivism rates. And the same folks are coming to build, and we think the recidivism rates are somewhere between 15 and 20%. Now, it was about 2 months ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, that the police chief and I and the head of the Chamber of Commerce, the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce, went to see our new Justice Minister and to talk to her, Conservative Justice Minister, about reducing the number of jails in Manitoba. And we were all completely on the same page on that. And so to me, that's very exciting when we can begin to engage new partners and begin to talk, those of us that would traditionally see ourselves on the left, to find new ways of engaging people on the right and approaching governments to try to move them into the new paradigm, which I define it as neatly as possible by saying that governments need to make it easy for problem solvers, and that's what they need to focus on. I mentioned earlier about how the federal government is actively suppressing First Nation social enterprises who are engaging in the local food economy. And I'd like now just to give you another example of that, and that is with our geothermal work. And I mentioned earlier that we had done $7 million worth of this work in the last 3 years. And the reason why we're able to do so much is because geothermal significantly reduces the amount of utility bills that people are paying. And how this works in Manitoba is that Manitoba Hydro provides us the money up front to install the geothermal system. It could be anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000. They then put a charge on the utility bill, which they continue to collect until they get all their money back. And the neat thing about it is that that charge is actually outweighed by the utility bill reductions. So there's net utility bill reductions right from the get-go. And that is a system in Manitoba we call pay as you save. And in May of this year, we had already trained new workers at the Wew'wasi-Kapo Ojibwe Nation. They have 400 houses at Wew'wasi-Kapo that we felt were good fits for geothermal. Well, 400 houses times $20,000 a house is $8 million worth of work, all of which would be paid back from out of the utility bill reductions. And we had signed a memorandum of understanding with Wew'wasi. We had trained their workers. We had sealed an agreement with Manitoba Hydro, and we're ready to proceed when the federal government actually told us that they would no longer be paying this financing fee in new First Nations like Wew'wasi-Kapo. So they actually stopped us from doing an $8 million economic development project that cost them no money at all. And this story is important because what they said was, what we want you to do is to apply for funding. So the minister's office got involved after we hit the media, and they actually offered us $8 million in funding to complete this geothermal project at Wew'wasi-Kapo, and we turned the money down because it immediately puts us back into colonial practices where the federal government feels that they need to maintain control, and the project would probably be tendered. The work would be done by outside contractors. There would be no local people trained, and it would avoid an opportunity to engage in the economic development process. And So we're actively lobbying the federal government now to remove these restrictions and to allow First Nations all across Canada, everywhere, the financing and supports to put in renewable energy systems that will save money over the lifetime of their equipment. And we can talk a bit more about that in the question and answer period if you like. So just a couple of slides left. In the book, I talk about my coworker here. His name is Chris Kershane, and you can hear a bit more from Chris. He and I did an interview on The Current last week, a CBC program. So if you Google The Current and The Disruptors is part of the series that we were talking about. You'll hear a bit from Chris and also from me about our work. Well, Chris started at Build, and when he was at Build, he received his driver's license. He got some parenting support, some housing advocacy. He took WMIS, first aid, CPR. He also did trades-based math and became a very good employee and coworker, an outstanding dad, by reconnecting to his kids and being present daily in their lives. And he's now a supervisor at Manitoba Green Retrofit. And in the book, tell the story about Chris in December 23rd last year, found himself in Walmart handing out his own personal money that he'd come across to customers at Walmart that he thought could use a little extra help at Christmas time. And I'll leave you to connect with that story, but it's a very moving story. And these are the type of people that I work with, and I've come to define them as heroes. And defining heroes as people who overcome daily barriers to achieve the things that the rest of us find easy. And Chris is one of many, and I love this picture because it's a real story, I think, of reconciliation, of how we can work together to provide better outcomes and to reconnect families and to make life more affordable for folks and to provide employment where there's no employment now. And so that is just a bit of a synopsis of what we do and how we do it, a bit of a piece on the book and where we've come from and where we're going. So with that, Darcy, that would complete the presentation that I wanted to talk about today, but wondered if we could get some questions or comments from folks and so that we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Shaun. That was a great presentation, and I know that for those of you who haven't read the book, it is a great read. I've got a copy beside me here filled with Post-it notes, and it enlightens a lot of these things and shows them with a fair bit of nuance and kind of threads all these kind of intersections together. So we're going to turn to the question and answer period now. Due to the large number of participants, we're not going to fire all the microphones on because we feel it might get a little unwieldy. So if you do have a question and would like to ask it over your phone or microphone, if you can raise your hand in the webinar room, and then we'll take a look there and identify, and we can unmute your microphone then. You raise your hand, but there's a button on the top bar. You'll see meeting, you'll see a phone and the sign for your speakers. There is the status, and you can raise your hand there to ask a question. But maybe just to kick us off here, Shaun, I have one question to pull out here. You referenced throughout the book the notion, and you kind of just touched on it at the end there, of the blurring of lines between community and government. Can you maybe elaborate more on that in the abstract, and also how you see that happening with some of the projects that you're putting, some of the solutions you're putting forward here?
Sure, great question. Although it's been nice, Darcy, if you had told me you were going to ask a question ahead of time on what it was you were going to ask. But I think I can handle that. Yeah, so we talk about how the innovation is going to happen as we move forward. And I really see it happening in the community sector, in the problem-solving sector. I was a senior civil servant with the government of Manitoba for 6 years. I was actually the director of energy policy, and just found it a very difficult place to bring about innovative change, and have made much more progress on making change, pushing government from outside. And I'll give you an example of child welfare. In Manitoba, we have 10,000 kids in care, and 89% of those, 8,900 of these children are Indigenous. And somewhere along the line, society and governments thought that Indigenous child welfare meant training Indigenous people to seize Indigenous kids. And the elders are telling us that Indigenous child welfare is actually about keeping families together. And so the question then is, how do we have a government system that is going to provide that kind of innovation? And in Manitoba, we have several things that are happening with Indigenous nonprofits that work really well. I'll give you one example of Mama Wichita, which does family conferencing. So there'll be a young woman that is expecting, and they will ask her to come in along with her support network, and the father to come in along with his support network. And it doesn't even matter if the two of them are together. But they then, with elders present, begin a conversation by saying, what is it that we can do to keep this child out of care? And we all know that if we can't figure this out in this room, what's going to happen to the child? And 85% of the time, they figure out something that is super exciting. So Kukum or grandma from the mom side will look after the baby on Mondays, and Mashomis or grandfather will look after the baby on Tuesdays, and the mom will attend school. There'll be some housing advocacy and so on, and that's very exciting. The problem is that governments are focusing on the problem. So it costs, by some estimates, $2 million to keep someone in care from baby to age 18. Mama Wichita's program costs about $10,000 per kid and per child. But governments have lots of money, it seems, for the $2 million approach, but no money for the $10,000 approach. So what we're proposing, which I talk about in the book, is how do we innovate the solutions. And it would be very similar to this pay-as-you-save model, which I described. Governments would say to Indigenous nonprofit providers of alternatives, if you've got an idea that works, that will keep kids out of care, we will finance it, and we will pay for that out of the future savings. And this is a type of thing that we need to put in government, the tools that are going to push this innovation. And so I'm very excited about the community sector and how, as Darcy says, we can blur the lines between what we think are public services now and solutions that are coming from the community. I also know someone asked earlier, maybe it was Drew, asking how it is that the government actually stopped this geothermal project at Wew'suwet'en. And what they did was they said that they didn't want social assistance they didn't think social assistance money should be going towards financing fees that were going back towards Manitoba Hydro. And that was their excuse. And when we told them, well, you're choosing high utility bills, which create no employment, over low utility bills that create employment, that didn't sway them at all, even though the bills by law in Manitoba have to go down in order for Manitoba Hydro to provide the financing. So clearly this, to us, wasn't about results. This was about maintaining a colonial system. So those are answers to a couple different questions. So Darcy, do you want to read off some more?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for answering those. I'm going to take one here, folks, and please, continue to type any questions that you have into the chat box, or let's see if there's any, or raise your hand, which it doesn't seem that there's any hands raised right now. There was a question emailed in from Murray Heidelbaugh. Sorry if I got your name there, last name wrong there, Murray. Wondering, how is it possible for a local economy that is based on decentralized production and delivery of locally consumed goods and services that requires a collaborative governance model, how can this coexist with our current market-driven economy that is based on centralization and private control of production and delivery of goods and services, and that's governed from a corporate sector who also generally has governance over the financial capital and key sections of government? So how can those things, Shaun, work in coexistence with each other?
People are very interested in solutions, and we're seeing foundations, for example, who have traditionally been focusing on granting. They're continuing to grant, but they're looking at their endowments. So in the case of the Winnipeg Foundation, they grant out $20 million a year, but they have a $400 million endowment, and they're looking at ways, other foundations as well across Canada, how can we invest some of that $400 million in local solutions and to have the economy start to spit out better results. We're also seeing charities like Me to We, which is run by the Kielburgers. Kielburgers lead that charity. And they're saying, look, we've been participating in raising money and building schools for a decade or more. But they also have 3 social enterprises now that are beginning to show that they're much better results, better use of their dollars and their time and their energy than the charitable works. And they actually have the social enterprises are earning money that they can plow back into their charitable works as well. So the two of them are kind of working more together. And Mark Kielburger was telling me a little while ago that he believes that the future of charities, the future of philanthropy is social enterprise. And so I think it's quite easy to move towards sort of this more decentralized approach that is more engaged in the community, and that some of the tools are going to be available that haven't been available before. So I thank Murray for that question.
Okay, thanks, Shaun. I'm going to bring it to a bit more of a simple question, but probably doesn't have a very simple answer. And this is from a good old friend of mine, guest 2. What are the economic fundamentals necessary for a social enterprise to succeed? Can you boil that down to some key cold notes on social enterprise success, Shaun?
Sure. I think the main thing, so especially those of us that kind of emerge from a nonprofit sector, is to realize that it's actually much easier to run a business than it is a nonprofit. And believe me, I've done both. Nonprofits receive funding usually, and governments are very, they feel very accountable for every nickel that's spent. And also nonprofit boards are very focused on avoiding risk. Social enterprises are quite different. They're more interested in mitigating risk, and there's lots of ways to do that. For example, having a lean startup. We have a healthy food market in Garden Hill in addition to the farm, and the way we started that wasn't to build a big store and to put up millions of dollars in capital. We just simply brought some healthy food up and put it on a table at the band office, and it sold immediately. And so the next time we tried it, we brought up 4 times as much, and it sold immediately. And then we quadrupled that amount, and it sold immediately, to the point now where on a good day we'll sell as many as 17 cases of bananas, which was in a recent market that we had, in addition to oranges and apples and so on. So I think that the main thing, to answer the question specifically, is to focus on the the business fundamentals. Like, you cannot run a social enterprise unless you've got revenues that are exceeding expenditures. And if you're focusing on the social outcomes primarily and not the business outcomes, you're going to run out of options in a real hurry. So mitigate risk rather than avoid it. There's lots of ways to do that. Make sure you've got a board that understands business fundamentals, and focus on a lean startup and get your idea going in a way that it can earn revenues and participate in the market economy by ensuring that revenues exceed expenditures.
Great. Thanks, Shaun. I'm going to move to a question from Paul Chamberlain, I believe working somewhere out of the Toronto area. Shaun, you've been very strong on how governments get in the way, and we all get that, and particularly with First Nations work. But he brings up the example here in Manitoba of the contractual support that Manitoba Housing does for social procurement, and how much Manitoba Housing drives the social enterprise community. This is an example of a government or quasi-government. It's actually a crown corporation, but it is under political direction, has helped. So this is an incident where the government has worked. Can you describe some of the conditions that led to that, or some of the steps that were taken from the community side to get this crown corporation to be on the right side of the problem?
Sure. So first of all, that is an excellent example I give about food and how governments are getting in the way of the reemergence of local food economy, and how governments are getting in the way of geothermal at places like Waiway-Sakapo. But in the book, I give lots of examples of how governments can be helpful, and Manitoba Housing is leading the country as far as we're concerned with social purchasing, and that is an excellent tool. And in fact, I would say in Canada that our defining issue is connecting people who most need the work with the work that most needs to be done. And social procurement is an excellent tool. In Scotland, there are 1,500 social enterprises that are hiring people with barriers to employment. I just want to repeat that so people can understand the magnitude of what we can do in the problem-solving sector. In Scotland, about the same size as Toronto, has 1,500 social enterprises that are hiring people with barriers to employment. So in Manitoba, we think we're getting somewhere. We might have 8 or 9, maybe max. And so I think we need to start looking at solutions that can scale, and social procurement is one of the most important ways to do that. The pay-as-you-save system is another tool to connect problem solvers to problems, and one in which I think is very important. But I talk about other examples in the book, and there are lots of them. But governments really need to start getting their heads around making it easy for problem solvers rather than making it difficult, and letting us take care of the problems. Thanks, Shaun.
I think I'm going to take a couple more questions before we wrap this up. Question from Shelby, and she's asking about advice in terms of working with First Nations and how you can establish trust and relationships, which I think is a pertinent question for those of us who are settlers here in Canada. How we work in a collaborative and partnership relationship with First Nations, given the history of colonialism that we are all the benefactors of. Shaun, could you speak to your experience with that?
Yes, most certainly. The first thing that we did, and Bill was a founding member of, I guess you could say, a co-founder of Aki Energy, but we co-founded it along with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, and they dedicated some of their staff time. Aki's current CEO, his name is Darcy Wood, and he worked at the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs for 12 years. He's Ojibwe, and he's the former chief of the Garden Hill First Nation. So we're not, Aki, our CEO, So first of all, we're a nonprofit, and our CEO is a former chief. Most of our employees are Indigenous, and our board is entirely made up of representatives from each First Nation that we partner with. And so when we go to a First Nation, it's not an outside non-Aboriginal company coming in. It's actually a First Nations entity that they feel they have control of and over. And it's a very great way to market. And so I think ACCI is an excellent example of how to engage First Nations, but it's almost First Nations engaging themselves. And those of us that are non-Aboriginal to fill in with our experiences and skill sets where there might be holes. The book talks a lot too. Just want to use this as an example. We're working at the Northlands Dene Silen First Nation. So it's a Dene community about 80 kilometers from Nunavut in the very northwestern part of Manitoba. And it's a diesel community, so it's one of the 4 First Nations in Manitoba, and I think there's something like 100 across Canada, where diesel fuel is hauled in to generate electricity and also to provide space heating. And the model is all mixed up because it's the federal government procuring this diesel fuel, and by many estimates, even though they're spending $1.80 a liter to get this stuff up there, they spend about that much on remediating the soil afterwards because it leaks and it's toxic. So we're turning that whole relationship on its head by starting a utility. And utility would be controlled by the First Nation, a social enterprise, and they would sell renewable heat to the federal government. And the federal government would then pay it as though it was purchasing, instead of diesel, it's purchasing renewable heat, and that the social enterprise would then use their surpluses to expand that model throughout their communities and to more First Nations. And so that to us is what reconciliation looks like. So it's not, an outside company going in to help. It's working with the First Nation so that it can actually have a problem solver and let the problem solver at the problem. And the government's job is to make the ecosystem or the economic conditions where that problem solver will be successful.
Okay. Well, thank you. So we are reaching the end of our time here. There were some questions, I believe, that were not answered. So we'll take those and we're going to share them with Shaun so that he can get that back to the participants directly, and we can carry on the conversation that way to get some of those final thoughts and final questions that you had answered. So if you're just going to take a bit of time, we're going to cover a lot of ground. Shaun, thank you very much for your time here. If you do not already have a copy of An Army of Problem Solvers, you can click the link that's on the screen right now, and you can put in your order today. And if you'd like to stay in touch and engage in other topics related to today's discussion, check out the Canadian CED Network's website or sign up to our free email newsletters. Also, you should have just received an email with a link to a 1-minute evaluation survey. Please take a second and fill it out right now. Your feedback is important to us, and we do like to reflect on those to ensure that we can improve the webinar series as we move forward. Many thanks once again to Shaun for giving us the sneak peek into his new book and for continuing to push for economic justice through the CED model of social enterprise. And thanks to all of our participants for their questions and participation. The webinar recording will be posted on our website in the coming days, and we'll send you the link as soon as it is available, along with any additional